You will cut it down by Friday, or I will have it bulldozed and bill you for every single cent, plus a $10,000 landscaping violation fee and a lien against your property." The voice, a shrill instrument of pure, undiluted entitlement, sliced through the morning air, more offensive than the diesel fumes of the idling front-loader she'd brought with her. Karen Miller, the recently self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stood on my lawn with her arms crossed, a plus-size dictator in a pastel pink tracksuit. Her face was a mask of smug certainty, a look I'd seen on second lieutenants who thought reading a manual made them experts in jungle warfare. They were usually the first to step on something they shouldn't. Karen was standing in a minefield of her own making and had no idea. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. She hadn't just sent a letter, she had brought the executioner's tools to the doorstep of a man who had owned this land since before her cookie-cutter mansion was a blueprint in some developer's filing cabinet. The threat wasn't just against my property, it was against a living memorial, a quarter century of devotion growing wild and beautiful along the edge of my 5 acres. She was pointing a manicured finger at my hedgerow, a 200-yard-long, 15-foot-high testament to nature that I had planted with my wife Eleanor back in 1998. It was a dense, thriving tapestry of hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, and dogwood, humming with the life of 1,000 bees and fluttering with the wings of finches and warblers. To Karen, it was just an overgrown bush that violated her vision of suburban homogeneity. To me, it was Eleanor's legacy, and this woman was threatening it with a bulldozer. The high-stakes absurdity of that moment, with the sun just cresting the trees and the sound of a heavy engine desecrating the peace, was the spark that lit the fuse. I knew this wasn't just about a hedge, it was about control, and she had picked a fight with a man who had spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers learning how to dismantle bullies, one regulation at a time. This is the kind of HOA nightmare that sounds impossible until it happens to you, and I can see by the fury in her eyes this is just the beginning. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping board member or a ridiculous rule, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from or share your own story. You're not alone in this fight, and trust me, you'll want to see how this one ends. Now, to understand the gravity of her mistake, you have to understand the history of this place. I bought this land in 1995, 3 years before I planted the first sapling for the hedgerow. It was just a raw parcel, 5 acres of rolling meadow bordering a state-protected creek. The developer who would later build the Willow Creek Estates was just starting to survey the adjacent farmland. I was a major in the Corps of Engineers, stationed at a base 2 hours away, and my wife Eleanor was a botanist with the university. This plot was our dream, our escape from the rigid lines of base housing. We closed on the property on our 10th anniversary. I remember Eleanor walking the property line, her hands trailing through the tall grass, her face lit with a joy so pure it felt like its own source of sunlight. "Mark," she'd said, her voice filled with vision, "this back line along the creek buffer, we could create a corridor, a real English-style hedgerow. It would connect the woods north of here to the creek basin. It would be a highway for wildlife." Her passion was infectious. For the next 3 years, we planned it meticulously. Eleanor, with her scientific mind and artist's soul, selected the native species. I, with my engineer's brain, planned the irrigation, the soil amendments, the precise staggered planting pattern that would create an impenetrable, interwoven barrier. In the spring of 1998, we planted 200 yards, hundreds of tiny, fragile saplings. It was backbreaking work. We spent every weekend that spring and summer digging, watering, and mulching. Our kids, then just young teenagers, complained endlessly, but they were out there with us, their hands in the same soil. It became a family ritual. That hedgerow wasn't just planted, it was raised. We nurtured it through droughts and freezes. We watched it grow from a line of twigs to a thick green wall, teeming with the life Eleanor had envisioned. But she did more than just plant it. Being Eleanor, she did it by the book. In August of 1998, she filed all the necessary paperwork with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife in the County Soil and Water Conservation District. She had the hedgerow officially designated as a protected wildlife corridor and erosion control barrier. It was a formal legal designation, recorded on the county plat maps and filed with the state. It wasn't just our hedge. It was a piece of state-recognized ecological infrastructure. It was permanent. The Willow Creek Estates development didn't break ground until 2002. When they did, the developer's own surveyors noted the protected status of my hedgerow on their plans. The initial HOA covenants, which I had to review as an adjacent landowner, specifically mentioned respecting all pre-existing land agreements and environmental protections. I never joined the HOA. I wasn't required to, as my property was not part of their subdivision. My only connection was a shared access road, for which I paid a reasonable annual maintenance fee. For 20 years it was peaceful. The HOA presidents came and went. They were mostly reasonable people who understood the history of the area. Then 6 months ago, Karen Miller and her husband bought the mansion directly behind my property. And 3 months after that, through a campaign of aggressive politicking and exploiting resident apathy, she got herself elected HOA president. Her first and only agenda item, it seemed, was to sanitize the neighborhood into her vision of perfection. And my wild, beautiful living hedgerow was her primary target. The low rumble of the bulldozer's engine was a physical insult, a vibration that traveled from the ground up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. I held Karen's gaze, my face a granite mask I'd perfected over decades of dealing with posturing contractors and belligerent local officials in war zones. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to stew in her own theatricality. Behind her, a burly man in a grease-stained shirt leaned against the colossal yellow machine, looking bored and slightly embarrassed, like a paid actor in a terrible play. "Karen, oh, damn," I said, my voice low and even, a stark contrast to her screeching. "Turn off the machine and tell your man to take it off my property." My lawn, not the HOA's common area. Another detail she'd conveniently overlooked. Her eyes narrowed. "I am the president of this homeowners association, and this overgrown monstrosity," she waved a dismissive hand at the hedgerow, "is a gross violation of Article 4, Section 2 of the community bylaws regarding landscape uniformity. It's an eyesore and a fire hazard." She recited the line as if it were scripture, a holy justification for her crusade. The problem was, she was preaching to the wrong man. I had read the bylaws years ago out of due diligence. I knew they didn't apply to me. "Your bylaws," I stated, not asked, "apply to the members of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I am not a member." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, quickly replaced by a renewed wave of indignant fury. "You use our roads. Your property borders our community. You are subject to our standards of appearance, whether you're a member or not. It's for the good of the community and to protect property values," she shrieked, her voice climbing an octave. "My only legal agreement with your association," I continued, my tone relentlessly calm, "is for the maintenance of the access road, an agreement established in 2003 and paid in full every year since. That agreement makes no mention of landscape uniformity or subjecting my pre-existing property to your newly invented aesthetic whims." I took a deliberate step forward. The bulldozer operator, sensing the shift in tone, actually sat up straighter in his cab. "Furthermore," I said, my voice dropping even lower, becoming gravelly, "that hedgerow is not an overgrown monstrosity. It is a state-recognized, legally protected wildlife corridor, established and recorded with the county and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife in 1998, 4 years before this HOA even existed." I let that hang in the air. The words "legally protected" and "state" have a certain weight that even the most oblivious power tripper can feel. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She was completely unprepared for a factual rebuttal. Her entire strategy was based on intimidation and the assumption that her title gave her absolute power. That's ridiculous," she stammered, recovering. "You can't just declare your bushes a national park. I've spoken to the HOA's legal counsel. They assure me we are well within our rights." I almost smiled. "Then your legal counsel is incompetent. Or more likely, you fed them a version of the story that omits the most critical facts, such as the fact that my property predates your subdivision and that the corridor's protected status is noted on the original plat maps filed by your own developer. I gestured towards the man on the bulldozer. So here's what's going to happen. You are going to tell your driver to remove his machine from my property immediately. Then you are going to leave. If that machine or any piece of equipment you've hired so much as scratches the bark on one of those trees, I will not be filing a complaint with your toothless HOA board. I will be filing a criminal complaint for destruction of state-protected property and trespassing, and a civil suit against you personally for damages that will make your $10,000 fine look like pocket change. The personal threat. That's what landed. The color drained from her face. The idea that she, Karen Miller, could be held personally liable was a concept she had clearly never entertained. Her power was a shield, and I had just shown her it was made of cardboard. She sputtered, This is not over. You will be hearing from our lawyers. You will be buried in fines." With a final furious glare, she spun around, her pink tracksuit a blur of indignation, and stomped toward her oversized SUV parked at the curb. She barked at the bulldozer operator, "Get it out of here, now!" The man, looking profoundly relieved, fired up the engine with a roar and began the slow, clumsy process of backing the machine off my lawn, leaving muddy tracks in the damp grass. I stood there until the rumble faded down the street, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a genuine, cool, clear anger. This was just the opening salvo. She had shown her hand, and I knew a woman like that wouldn't retreat. She would double down. She would escalate, and I would have to be ready. I walked over to the edge of the hedgerow, the place where Eleanor and I had planted the first hawthorn sapling. A monarch butterfly drifted past, landing on a spray of late-season blossoms. The low hum of insects was the only sound. This wasn't just about a fight with a neighbor. This was about defending a promise. I went inside and pulled out the old, thick file folder labeled Property Creekwood Lane. It was time to go to war. The first official salvo from Karen arrived 3 days later, delivered by a certified mail carrier who had the weary look of someone who frequently delivered bad news. It was a thick envelope embossed with the officious Willow Creek Estates HOA logo. Inside was not just one letter, but a sheaf of them, a meticulously compiled portfolio of trumped-up charges. The cover letter, signed with a flamboyant, aggressive flourish by Karen Miller, President, informed me that I was being fined $1,000 for failure to maintain landscape and an additional $500 for non-conforming property feature. It stated that these fines would be levied daily until the offending vegetation was removed. Attached were photographs of my hedgerow taken from multiple angles, as if it were a crime scene. There were close-ups of leaves, branches, and even a picture of a bird's nest, which was ironically labeled debris accumulation. The pièce de résistance was a formal notice that a special session of the Architectural Review Committee had been convened, a committee Karen herself chaired, and had unanimously voted to deny my unapproved structure. They were treating a living ecosystem like an illegally built garden shed. The sheer bureaucratic audacity was almost impressive. They had built a fortress of paper, believing it was impregnable. They didn't know I'd spent a career navigating and sometimes dismantling far more complex bureaucracies than a suburban HOA. My first call was to my old friend and comrade, Dave Jeffries. Dave had been a colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army's legal arm. He'd retired a few years after I did and now ran a quiet civil law practice. He was the sharpest, most methodical legal mind I knew. "Dave, it's Mark Caldwell," I said when he answered. "Mark, good to hear your voice. Don't tell me you have finally decided to take up golf." "Worse," I said, "I'm in a war with an HOA." I could hear him chuckle on the other end. "Ah, the civilian world's version of asymmetric warfare. Let me guess, the color of your mailbox?" "The existence of a 25-year-old state-protected wildlife corridor," I replied. The chuckle stopped. "Say that again." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire situation. The history of the property, Eleanor's work, the legal designation, Karen's theatrical appearance with the bulldozer, and the mountain of fines I was now holding. I could practically hear the gears turning in Dave's head. "Mark, this is beautiful," he said, his voice alight with professional interest. It's a classic case of jurisdictional overreach compounded by willful ignorance. She's a bully who thinks a title gives her power, but she's firing her cannons from a ship made of papier-mâché. So what's our first move, counsel? I asked, falling back into the old familiar dynamic. Documentation, he said immediately. We fight paper with better paper. You have the original file from '98, the one with the state and county filings. I'm holding it in my hand, I said. Perfect. Scan every single page. The deeds, the plat maps, the application to Fish and Wildlife, their letter of approval, the county recordation. Everything. Create a single high-resolution PDF. Title it Notice of Pre-Existing Protected Land Use. That's our Bible. Second, start a log. Document every interaction. Time, date, who was present, what was said. Her little stunt with the bulldozer is entry number 1. These fines are entry number 2. From now on, you communicate with her and the board only in writing. Email is best. It creates a time-stamped record. What about the upcoming HOA meeting? I asked. They have their monthly meeting next Tuesday. I'm not on the agenda, but there's a public comment period. You'll go, Dave said decisively, but you won't go to argue. You'll go to create a public record. You'll stand up during the public comment, state your name and address for the record. You will calmly and clearly state that you are not a member of the HOA, that your property is not subject to their covenants, and that the hedgerow in question is a legally protected wildlife corridor predating the HOA's existence. You will then hand a physical copy of your documentation packet to every single board member and a copy to the secretary to be entered into the official minutes. You will not answer questions. You will not get into a debate. You will make your statement, deliver the documents, and sit down. Let them choke on it. It was a classic military strategy. Establish a fortified position and force the enemy to react. I felt a familiar calm settle over me. This was a mission, and I had a plan. I spent the rest of the day at my scanner, digitizing 2 decades of history. The faded ink on Eleanor's carefully typed application, her precise signature, the official state seal on the approval letter. Each document was a piece of armor. That evening, I drafted an email to Karen and the entire HOA board. It was concise and professional. Dear Ms. Miller and members of the board, it began, I am in receipt of your correspondence dated date, levying fines against my property. Please be advised that your actions constitute an illegal attempt to assert authority outside your jurisdiction. My property at 112 Creekwood Lane is not part of the Willow Creek Estates subdivision and is not subject to your association's covenants. Furthermore, the hedgerow you have targeted is a legally protected entity under the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, a status established in 1998. Any attempt to damage or remove it is a violation of state law. All fines are hereby rejected. I will be attending the upcoming board meeting on date to present the board with the full legal documentation of the corridor's protected status for the official record. I expect you to cease all harassment and retract all fines immediately. I attached the PDF Dave and I had assembled, the Bible, and hit send. The first shot in the paper war had been fired. I knew it wouldn't deter Karen, but it wasn't meant to. It was meant to put the entire board on notice. They could no longer claim ignorance. From this point forward, every action they took would be with full knowledge of the facts, and that made their culpability and their liability crystal clear. The night of the HOA meeting, the community clubhouse was exactly as I'd pictured it. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting that hummed with an irritating frequency, and about 30 folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long table. At the table sat Karen and her board, a collection of 4 other residents who radiated a mixture of self-importance and nervous complicity. Karen in the center seat wore a royal blue blazer with shoulders so padded it looked like she was preparing for combat. She beamed at the sparse crowd, a benevolent dictator surveying her subjects. I took a seat in the back row, my briefcase containing 5 neatly bound copies of my documentation resting on my lap. I recognized a few faces. The Hendersons, an elderly couple who had lived on the edge of the development since it was built, gave me a small, sympathetic nod. A few others, newer residents, glanced at me with curiosity before quickly looking away, as if eye contact might get them in trouble. The meeting began with the tedious drone of procedural formalities. The approval of the previous month's minutes, the treasurer's report, a lengthy and mind-numbing discussion about whether pet waste stations should have bags with handles or not. Karen ran the meeting with an iron fist, cutting off anyone who rambled and steering every conversation back to her preferred outcome. I could see how she'd taken control. She weaponized boredom and procedure, wearing down any opposition until they simply gave up. Finally, after 45 minutes, she announced, "We now open the floor for our 5-minute public comment period. Please state your name and address for the record." This was my moment. I stood up and walked to the front, placing my briefcase on the floor beside the small lectern provided for speakers. "Good evening. My name is Mark Caldwell. I reside at 112 Creekwood Lane." A murmur went through the room. Karen's smile tightened, the muscles in her jaw flexing. She knew why I was here. Her eyes darted to the other board members, a silent command to present a unified, unflinching front. "As you are aware," I began, my voice calm and projecting easily through the room, "I am not a member of this association. However, the board has recently taken an aggressive and legally unfounded interest in my property." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I am here tonight to formally put the board on notice. The hedgerow on the southern border of my property, which President Miller has threatened to destroy, is not simply landscaping. It is a protected wildlife corridor, legally designated by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife in August of 1998. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the bound documents. This designation predates the existence of Willow Creek Estates in this HOA. It is a legally binding land use designation recorded with the county. Your bylaws do not and cannot supersede state law and pre-existing recorded property covenants. I walked along the front table, placing a thick, spiral-bound copy in front of each of the 5 board members. Karen stared at the document I placed before her as if it were a venomous snake. "This packet," I continued, my voice resonating with authority, "contains the original application, the state's letter of approval, the official recordation with the county plat office, and relevant sections of state environmental law. I am providing a copy to each of you and one for the association's secretary so that it may be entered into the permanent record of this meeting. By accepting these documents, the board is now formally notified of the hedgerow's protected status. Any further action taken against it, including the levying of fines, threats, or attempts at removal, will be considered a willful violation of state law, and I will pursue all available legal remedies against both the association and board members individually." The word individually hung in the sterile fluorescent air like a toxic gas. I saw one of the board members, a mousy-looking man named Gerald, visibly pale. He picked up the document and started flipping through it, his eyes wide. Karen, however, was made of sterner stuff. She pushed the document away from her as if it were contaminated. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we appreciate your historical documents. However, the Architectural Review Committee has already reviewed your case and found you in violation. The board stands by that decision. This is a matter of community standards." "There is no case to review," I countered, holding her gaze. "There is only a fact, a legal fact you have now been made aware of. Your committee's decision is irrelevant and unenforceable. I am not here to debate. I am here to provide you with the information you need to avoid breaking the law. What you do with that information is up to you, but you will not be able to claim ignorance." I turned from the lectern. "My 5 minutes are up. Thank you for your time." As I walked back to my seat, the room was utterly silent. I could feel every eye on me. I had dropped a bomb of pure, unassailable fact into their little kingdom of opinions. The Hendersons were now looking at me with open admiration. Mr. Henderson gave me a subtle thumbs up. The rest of the meeting was a farce. Karen tried to regain control, moving on to a discussion about holiday decoration rules, but the energy in the room had shifted. The board members kept glancing down at the documents I'd given them. Gerald, the pale man, didn't look up from his copy for the rest of the meeting, his brow furrowed in deep concern. When the meeting adjourned, several people made a point to walk past me. A woman I didn't know whispered, "Good for you," as she passed. But the most important interaction came as I was leaving. Mr. Henderson, a retired history teacher with kind eyes, stopped me in the parking lot. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his wife nodding beside him. "That was magnificent. My wife and I, we've lived here since the beginning. We remember when this was all fields. We remember you and your wife planting that hedge. It's a beautiful thing." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "I appreciate that." "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "This woman, Karen, she's a tyrant. She bullies everyone. People are afraid of her. She got elected because only her little clique showed up to vote. If you're going to fight her, you're going to need more than just facts. You're going to need allies." He pressed a piece of paper into my hand. "This is a list of a few of the original homeowners. People who remember the way things were. People who are fed up. Talk to them. You're not as alone as you think." I looked down at the paper. It had 4 names and phone numbers on it. It was more than just a list. It was the beginning of an insurgency. The paper war was phase 1. Phase 2, building a coalition, had just begun. Armed with Arthur Henderson's list and a renewed sense of purpose, I spent the next week on a new mission: reconnaissance and recruitment. My first call was to a name on the list, a woman named Maria Flores. She was a widow who lived in one of the first homes built in the development, her property bordering a small patch of woods the developer had left intact. When I introduced myself over the phone, her initial tone was cautious, guarded. But when I mentioned the hedgerow, her voice warmed immediately. "Oh, the bird hedge," she said. "I love that hedge. My husband and I used to sit on our back porch and watch the goldfinches. I can't believe she wants you to cut it down." That woman is a menace. I met her for coffee the next day. Maria was a small, fiery woman in her late 60s with a sharp mind and a deep-seated sense of justice. She told me stories about Karen's reign of terror, fines for leaving a garbage can out for 2 hours too long, violation notices for children's toys left in a driveway, a demand that the Martinez family, 2 houses down from her, repaint their front door because the shade of blue was, in Karen's words, aesthetically jarring. "She has a little group of followers," Maria explained, stirring her cappuccino with vigor. "People who like the power, who feel important finding their neighbors. But most people, they're quiet because they're scared. She threatened to put a lien on the Martinez's house over a door, Mark. A lien. They're a young couple with a new baby. They couldn't afford a fight, so they repainted it gray. She wants everything to be gray." Maria became my first and most crucial ally. She knew everyone. She knew the history, the grudges, the quiet resentments simmering beneath the surface of Willow Creek's placid facade. She helped me connect with the other names on Arthur's list, and each conversation added another layer to the portrait of Karen's abusive governance. But I knew I needed more than anecdotal evidence and a handful of disgruntled old-timers. I needed a legal heavyweight in my corner, someone who could operate inside the system. That's when I found Sarah Jenkins. She wasn't on Arthur's list. I found her by sheer luck. I was at a local cafe reviewing my log of interactions with Karen when I overheard a conversation at the next table. A young woman was on the phone, her voice a low, controlled burn. "No, you don't understand," she was saying. "The HOA covenant does not grant them the right to dictate the species of tomato plants in your personal garden beds. That is a gross overreach of their authority. Tell Mr. Patterson to send me their violation notice. We'll draft a response that will make their heads spin." My ears perked up. I waited until she finished her call. "Excuse me," I said, leaning over. "I couldn't help but overhear. It sounds like you have some experience with overzealous HOAs." She looked up, a sharp, intelligent woman in her early 30s with a no-nonsense air about her. "You could say that. I'm a property law attorney. It's what I do." "Do you live in Willow Creek Estates?" I asked. A wry smile touched her lips. "Moved in 3 months ago. I've already received 3 violation notices. One for my welcome mat, which apparently has unapproved font, one for a wind chime my mother gave me, and one because my security camera is not a model on their approved list. I'm currently using their own bylaws to tie them in procedural knots." It was kismet. I introduced myself and gave her the 30-second version of my story. Her eyes lit up with a familiar fire I'd seen in Dave's, the fire of a legal mind presented with a perfect, beautiful case of injustice. "She threatened you with a bulldozer?" she asked. a grin spreading across her face. And your hedgerow is a state-protected wildlife corridor that predates the entire subdivision? Oh, this is glorious. This isn't just a simple overreach case. This is a slam dunk wrapped in a constitutional question about prior use rights. I hired Sarah on the spot. We met at her small, tidy office the following day. I brought Dave in on a conference call, and the three of us formed a command staff. Dave, the seasoned strategist, Sarah, the agile frontline tactician specializing in property law, and me, the client, the ground commander with the complete intelligence package. Here's what she's going to do next, Sarah said, pacing in front of her whiteboard. You humiliated her at that meeting. A narcissist like that can't let it go. She's not going to back down. She's going to escalate. She'll ignore your documents, or her lawyer will invent some flimsy pretext to dismiss them. She's going to push for a lien on your property. Let her, Dave's voice crackled from the speakerphone. A lien is a legal action. It requires a court filing. That gives us a venue to countersue and, more importantly, it opens the door to discovery. Exactly, Sarah said, pointing a marker at me. That's our kill box. Once she files a suit or a lien, we can subpoena everything. Board meeting minutes, internal emails, financial records, everything. Right now, we're fighting in the dark. We need to get their records into the light. Our strategy was set. We would let Karen make the next move. In the meantime, Sarah began drafting preemptive legal notices to send to the state agencies, informing them of a potential threat to the protected corridor. I, with Maria's help, started a quiet campaign of information. We didn't hold meetings or hand out flyers. We just talked to people one-on-one. I'd go for a walk and happen to strike up a conversation with someone washing their car. Maria would chat with neighbors over the fence. We didn't ask for support. We just told my story, calmly and factually. We planted seeds of doubt about Karen's leadership. The daily fines continued to arrive in the mail. I logged each one and sent a formal, templated email response for each, rejecting the fine and restating the legal facts. It was a war of attrition. Karen was building a mountain of paper she thought was a weapon, but we knew it was a pyre, and she was just waiting for the right moment to light it herself. The community was a sleeping giant. Karen's bullying had been 1,000 small cuts. My fight was different. It was a clear, unambiguous line in the sand, and people were starting to watch, wondering which side to be on. The next phase of Karen's assault was subtler, more insidious. The daily fines continued to pile up, a stack of unopened envelopes on my desk that now represented a theoretical debt of over $20,000. But the direct confrontation ceased. Instead, a campaign of passive-aggressive harassment began. HOA contracted landscaping trucks would park in front of my driveway for hours, their crews taking extended lunch breaks. Twice, I found small piles of grass clippings and lawn debris dumped just on my side of the property line, a petty and childish gesture. Anonymous complaints were filed with the county about my property. One for a potential fire hazard, my woodpile, neatly stacked 100 feet from any structure. Another for uncontrolled animal habitation, the birds in the hedgerow. Each complaint required me to meet with a county inspector who would arrive, look at my property, apologize for wasting my time, and sign off that the complaint was unfounded. It was a classic death by 1,000 cuts strategy designed to wear me down, to exhaust my patience and my resources. I documented everything in my log, complete with photos and the official reports from the county inspectors. Each act of harassment was another nail Karen was hammering into her own coffin. Meanwhile, Sarah and I were building our counteroffensive. While Karen was focused on petty torments, we were thinking bigger. It's time to bring in the heavy guns, Sarah said during one of our strategy sessions. We've notified the state agencies, but that was just a letter. We need them here, on the ground. We need an official site visit. She was right. A letter could be ignored or filed away. But a state official in a government vehicle, walking the property line with a clipboard, was a visual statement of authority that Karen couldn't dismiss. I used my old Corps of Engineers contacts to find the right person to call at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Not some junior clerk, but the Regional Director of Habitat Management, a man named Bill Peterson. I explained the situation, emphasizing the escalating harassment and the imminent threat to a corridor his own department had certified. "Colonel Caldwell," Peterson said, his voice serious, "we don't take kindly to threats against protected habitats. The establishment of these corridors is a cornerstone of our regional conservation strategy. An HOA board has zero jurisdiction here. I'll be in your area next week. How about I schedule a formal site assessment for Wednesday at 10 a.m.? I'll bring along a colleague from the County Environmental Protection Office." The day of the inspection was bright and clear. At 9:55 a.m., two official vehicles, one from the state DFW, the other from the county, pulled up to my house. Bill Peterson was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, dressed in practical field gear. His county counterpart, a younger woman named Dr. Evans, was sharp and professional. I walked them along the entire 200-yard length of the hedgerow. They were impressed. "This is a magnificent specimen, Colonel," Peterson said, examining a thicket of dogwood. "The maturity and diversity here are exceptional. You can see the wildlife trails leading into it. It's a perfect example of what these corridors are meant to be." Dr. Evans was taking soil samples and making notes. "The erosion control aspect is undeniable," she said, pointing to the clear, stable creek bank on my property versus the slightly undercut bank further down. "This vegetation is holding the entire streamside ecosystem together." As they were finishing their assessment, right on cue, Karen Miller came marching down the street. She had clearly seen the official vehicles and couldn't resist inserting herself. She had two of her board cronies, including the pale and nervous Gerald, trailing behind her like reluctant foot soldiers. "I'm Karen Miller, president of the HOA," she announced, planting herself in front of Peterson, hands on her hips. "What's going on here? Is this about the violation?" Peterson turned to her, his expression unreadable. He held out his hand. "Bill Peterson, Regional Director for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this is Dr. Evans from the County Environmental Protection Office. We're conducting a formal assessment of this protected wildlife corridor." The words regional director and protected seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air around Karen. She stared at his offered hand but didn't take it. "Protected? That's just some story he made up," she said, gesturing at me. "It's an overgrown hedge, and it violates our community's bylaws." Peterson's professional calm was unshakable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but polite, "this corridor's protected status was legally recorded in 1998. It's a matter of public record, which Mr. Caldwell was kind enough to provide. Frankly, its ecological value is even greater than the original documents suggest. It's a model habitat." He then turned to Dr. Evans. "Dr. Evans, is there any validity to the HOA's claim that this constitutes a fire hazard or any other environmental negative?" Dr. Evans looked up from her notes and fixed Karen with a steely gaze. "Quite the opposite, Ms. Miller. A healthy, diverse hedgerow like this acts as a fire break, retains moisture, and prevents soil erosion and water pollution. From an environmental standpoint, removing it would be grossly irresponsible. In fact, given its function in protecting the creek, which is a county-regulated waterway, any unauthorized attempt to remove it could result in severe penalties from our office, in addition to whatever the state imposes." The 1-2 punch was devastating. State and county. Fines and penalties. Karen's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from arrogant certainty to confusion, then to flushed, sputtering rage. Gerald behind her looked like he was about to be physically ill. "You can't, I am the president," she finally managed to stammer out. "We have rules." Peterson just looked at her. "And we have laws," he said quietly. He then turned to me. "Colonel, you'll receive our official report within a week. It will reiterate the corridor's protected status and its significant environmental benefits. We will also be sending a formal letter of notification to the Willow Creek Estates HOA, advising them to cease and desist all actions and threats against this habitat. Any further harassment should be reported directly to my office." He handed me his card, gave Karen a final dismissive glance, and he and Dr. Evans walked back to their trucks. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, her face a thunderous mask. She had brought her schoolyard bully tactics to a gunfight and had just been confronted by 2 4-star generals who told her to stand down. She didn't say another word. She just spun around and stomped back to her house, her 2 board members scurrying after her. I knew this wasn't the end. A creature like Karen, when cornered and publicly humiliated, doesn't retreat. She becomes more dangerous. The official warnings wouldn't placate her. They would enrage her. She would see this as a conspiracy, a personal attack on her authority. And I knew with chilling certainty that her next move would be to escalate beyond letters and petty harassment. She was going to try to use the courts. And just as Dave and Sarah had predicted, that's exactly where we wanted her. True to his word, Bill Peterson's official report arrived 5 days later. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic force, a 5-page document complete with photographs, ecological data, and a summary that described my hedgerow not as a bush, but as a critical microhabitat and vital component of the Regional Watershed Protection Plan. Copies were sent, as promised, to the HOA's official address. The cease and desist letter from the Department of Fish and Wildlife that followed was even more blunt. It cited state statutes and administrative codes and warned of fines up to $25,000 per day for any damage inflicted upon the protected corridor. For any rational person, this would have been the end of the conflict, a clear, unambiguous stop sign from two different government bodies. But Karen Miller was not a rational person. She was an ideologue, and her ideology was her own absolute authority. To her, the state and county were just meddling outsiders, co-opted by her enemy. Her humiliation in front of the officials had only hardened her resolve. She was like a cornered animal, and she was about to make her most reckless move. About a week after the state's letter arrived, I was in my workshop sharpening a set of chisels when I saw the process server's car pull into my driveway. He was a young man in a cheap suit, looking nervous as he walked to my front door. I met him on the porch. "Mark Caldwell?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me a thick, legal-size envelope. "You've been served." I took the envelope, thanked him, and went inside. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. The lawsuit was not just from the HOA, it was a personal suit. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and Karen Miller, in her official capacity as president, versus Mark T. Caldwell. They were suing me personally to force a nuisance abatement, legal jargon for tearing down my hedgerow. They were also seeking to foreclose on the lien for the accumulated bogus fines, which they now claim totaled over $35,000, plus legal fees. It was a declaration of total war. I immediately called Sarah, then patched in Dave. I read the key points of the lawsuit to them over the speakerphone. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard Sarah let out a low whistle. "She actually did it," Sarah said, a note of disbelief and excitement in her voice. "She hired the HOA's high-priced law firm to sue you personally over a legally protected habitat, even after receiving cease and desist orders from the state. This isn't just malpractice on her lawyer's part. This is malicious prosecution." "They've just handed us the keys to the kingdom," Dave's voice rumbled. "Mark, this is the best thing that could have happened. Her ego has completely overridden any legal sense she or her counsel might have had." "Explain the keys to the kingdom part to me again," I said, though I already knew the answer. "Discovery," Sarah and Dave said in unison. "In a civil suit," Sarah elaborated, "both parties have the right to request evidence from the other side. It's a legally compulsory process. We can now subpoena any and all records relevant to the case. And since she is suing you over HOA rules and her authority as president, everything is relevant. Every email she's ever sent from her HOA account. Every text message related to this issue. The minutes of every board meeting, including the executive sessions they thought were private. All financial records, invoices, and expense reports for the last 2 years. We're not just looking for evidence about the hedgerow anymore," Dave added. "We're looking for a pattern of behavior. We're looking for abuse of power, selective enforcement, misappropriation of funds, anything that proves she is acting not in the interest of the community, but out of personal animus and a lust for control. We are going to put her entire presidency on trial." The lawsuit was her ultimate weapon, but she had just handed it to us, pointed squarely at herself. The cost of this litigation to the HOA would be astronomical, all to pursue a personal vendetta she was guaranteed to lose. Within hours, Sarah had drafted our official response, denying all claims and asserting our counterclaims. But more importantly, she drafted our first motion for discovery. It was a work of art, a document of breathtaking scope. We demanded one, all internal and external communications, including emails, text messages, and recorded calls from Karen Miller and all board members relating to me, my property, or the Hedgerow. Two, all HOA financial records from the date Karen took office, including bank statements, budgets, expense reports, and invoices. Three, the complete, unredacted minutes of all board meetings and architectural review committee meetings. Four, a list of all violation notices issued by the HOA during Karen's presidency, including the nature of the violation and its resolution, that is, fine paid, issue corrected, or fine waived. Five, the employment contracts and invoices for the HOA's law firm and landscaping company. We sent it to the HOA's lawyers. Their response was telling. They filed a motion to quash our discovery request, calling it overly broad, burdensome, and a fishing expedition. It was a standard legal maneuver, but it was also a sign of panic. They knew what was in those records, and they were terrified of us seeing it. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, heard the motion a week later. The HOA's lawyer argued passionately that we were harassing his clients. Sarah's response was simple and devastating. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiffs are suing my client for over $35,000 and demanding the destruction of a significant portion of his property based on their authority as an HOA. To defend himself, my client is entitled to examine how that authority has been wielded. If they have nothing to hide, this request should not be burdensome at all." The judge agreed. She denied their motion to quash and gave them 30 days to produce every single document we had asked for. The look on the opposing lawyer's face was a mixture of shock and horror. He had walked into court expecting a routine procedural hearing and had walked out with an order to hand over the evidence that would likely destroy his client's case and career as HOA president. The trap was sprung. Now all we had to do was wait for the evidence to pour in. The boxes arrived at Sarah's office exactly 30 days later on the court-mandated deadline. There were 6 of them, filled to the brim with thousands of pages of documents, plus 3 thumb drives containing emails and financial data. The HOA's lawyers had clearly tried to bury us in volume, a tactic known as a document dump, hoping we'd miss the important details in the sheer mass of paper and digital files. They underestimated their opponent. I was a man who had managed logistics for Corps of Engineers projects with budgets in the hundreds of millions. Sifting through data to find a critical piece of intelligence was second nature. Sarah was a lawyer who delighted in the details. And Dave, via conference call, was our strategic overseer. We turned Sarah's conference room into a war room. We set up a large whiteboard, got stacks of colored highlighters, and started brewing coffee. For the next 2 weeks, we lived and breathed the inner workings of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. The first few days were a slog organizing the chaos. We sorted the documents into categories: financials, meeting minutes, violation notices, and communications. Then slowly, patterns began to emerge. The first bombshell came from the violation log. We cross-referenced the list of every violation notice issued under Karen's presidency with the financial records of fines paid versus fines waived. The picture it painted was stark. Residents in Karen's known circle of friends had their violations for things like leaving basketball hoops out or unapproved landscape lighting consistently waived after a special review. Meanwhile, people like the Martinez family of the aesthetically jarring blue door and others outside her clique were pursued relentlessly. The records showed the HOA had spent over $5,000 in legal fees just to force the Martinez family to repaint that door. It was a clear, documented pattern of selective and vindictive enforcement. But the real gold was in the emails. The thumb drives contained the entire archive of Karen's official HOA email account. She had clearly been arrogant enough to believe these communications would never see the light of day. Reading them was like peering into the mind of a petty tyrant. In one email chain to her board, from the day after our first confrontation, she wrote, "This man Caldwell is an arrogant obstructionist who thinks he's above our community. We need to make an example of him. Start issuing daily fines. I want him buried in paper. Don't worry about the legal side, I'll handle it. In another after the state official's visit, she wrote to the HOA's lawyer, the DFW is clearly biased and in Caldwell's pocket. We need to ignore them and sue him immediately. We will crush him in court. Spare no expense. The phrase spare no expense appeared frequently, always in reference to her crusades against residents she disliked. But the smoking gun, the one that made Sarah actually gasp, was an invoice from Prestige Landscaping, the HOA's official contractor. The invoice was for $3,800 for emergency tree removal and stump grinding. It was dated from last spring. That wasn't unusual. But tucked into the financial data was a separate work order that corresponded to that invoice. The address on the work order was not a common area. It was Karen Miller's private residence. She had used HOA funds to pay for the removal of 2 large, diseased pine trees from her own backyard, disguising it as a common area expense. We cross-referenced it with Google Earth's historical satellite imagery. Sure enough, 2 large pines visible on her property in an image from a year ago were gone in the most recent one. This wasn't just abuse of power anymore. This was embezzlement. Plain and simple. We've got her, I said, a cold, satisfying certainty washing over me. We've got her on selective enforcement, malicious prosecution, and misappropriation of funds. It's better than that, Dave said over the speaker. The misappropriation of funds pierces the corporate veil. The HOA's liability insurance will likely deny their claim when this comes out, because it stems from a criminal act by a board member, which means Karen and any board member who knowingly went along with this could be held personally liable for the HOA's massive legal bills. The final piece of the puzzle was the meeting minutes. Most were sanitized, but in the minutes for an emergency executive session following the state official's visit, the secretary had noted, Member Gerald Finney expressed grave concerns about the potential legal and financial exposure to the association. President Miller dismissed his concerns, stated the matter was one of principle, and called for a vote to proceed with litigation. The vote passed 4-1, with Member Finney dissenting. Gerald Finney, the nervous, pale man, he had objected. He was on record. He was our way in to crack the board's unified front. We now had a complete arsenal. We had the legal high ground with the state-protected status of the Hedgerow. We had proof of a personal vendetta. We had evidence of widespread abuse of power. And we had the financial records of a criminal act. The lawsuit against me was no longer a threat. It was a gift. It was the stage upon which we would not only defend my property, but dismantle Karen Miller's entire corrupt regime. Sarah began preparing our motion for summary judgment, a legal filing that basically asked the judge to dismiss the case because the evidence is so overwhelmingly in our favor. But we decided to hold it back for a moment. A quiet courtroom victory wasn't enough. The community that had been terrorized by this woman deserved a public accounting. It was time to take this evidence out of the war room and into the light of day. It was time to call a special meeting of the homeowners. Under the HOA's own bylaws, a special meeting of the membership could be called with a petition signed by just 15% of the homeowners. Thanks to the groundwork laid by Maria Flores and Arthur Henderson and the growing discontent over Karen's increasingly erratic behavior, getting the signatures was surprisingly easy. People were fed up. The news of the lawsuit against me had spread, and many residents were horrified to learn that their HOA fees were being used to fund a personal vendetta that was clearly doomed. Within a week, we had signatures from nearly a third of the community. Sarah drafted the formal petition, and I delivered it to the HOA's management company, legally obligating them to schedule the meeting. Karen, of course, tried to block it. She claimed the signatures were invalid and that the petition was improperly filed. But we had followed her own rulebook to the letter. She was forced to schedule the meeting in the community clubhouse, the same beige room where I had made my stand weeks before. This time, however, the atmosphere would be profoundly different. The night of the special meeting, the room was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The 30 or so residents from the regular monthly meeting had swelled to over 100. The nervous silence of that previous meeting was replaced by an audible buzz of anticipation and anger. Maria and Arthur had worked the phones, ensuring everyone knew this was not just another boring meeting. This was a reckoning. Karen and her four board members sat at the front table, looking beleaguered and defensive. Karen, wearing a severe black jacket, gripped her gavel like a weapon. She tried to open the meeting with her usual procedural drone, but the crowd was not having it. "Just get to the special agenda item," someone shouted from the back. Karen's face flushed. "This is a formal meeting, and we will maintain decorum," she snapped. I stood up. "Miss Miller, as the lead petitioner, I'd like to begin the presentation for which this meeting was called." All eyes turned to me. Sarah was by my side, carrying a projector and a laptop. Dave had driven in for the occasion and was sitting in the front row, a formidable, calming presence. We had this choreographed like a military operation. Karen, seeing she had lost control of the room, had no choice but to cede the floor. "The floor is yours, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice dripping with venom. Sarah set up the projector, and the first image flashed onto the screen against the beige wall, a high-resolution photo of my vibrant green hedgerow. "Some of you know me," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Many of you don't. My name is Mark Caldwell. I've owned my property on Creekwood Lane since 1995. The one gestured to the screen is the hedgerow my wife and I planted in 1998. This is what our HOA president, Karen Miller, has spent tens of thousands of your dollars us trying to force me to destroy." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "Ms. Miller has told you this is about community standards and property values. I'm here tonight to show you the truth. The truth is in the documents her own lawsuit forced her to provide." The next slide was a copy of the State Department of Fish and Wildlife designation from 1998. This is a legally protected wildlife corridor. This fact was presented to the board. They chose to ignore it. Click. The next slide showed the cease and desist order from the state. The state then ordered them to stop. They chose to ignore that too. Instead, they chose to sue me, using your money. The anger in the room was becoming palpable. "But this was never about a hedge," I continued, my voice hardening. "This was about power, and we now have the proof." Sarah took over. "As Mr. Caldwell's attorney," she said, her voice sharp and precise, "I can tell you that the discovery process in this lawsuit has revealed a disturbing pattern of mismanagement and abuse by this board, led by Miss Miller." Click. The next slide was a chart. On one side, a list of Karen's friends who had received violation notices. On the other, the resolution, waived. On the other side of the chart was another list of names: the Martinez family, a young couple I didn't know, an elderly man, and their resolution, fines levied, legal action taken. "This is selective enforcement," Sarah said, "using the rules to punish your enemies and reward your friends. It's an abuse of your trust." Click. The next slide showed an email from Karen to the board, the one where she wrote, "I want him buried in paper." The crowd gasped. People were reading the words on the screen, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. "This is evidence of a personal vendetta," Sarah said. "A malicious campaign funded by you, the homeowners." Then came the final devastating blow. Click. The screen showed the $3,800 invoice from Prestige Landscaping side by side with the work order for tree removal at Karen Miller's private address. "And this," Sarah said, her voice dropping for dramatic effect, "is embezzlement. This is President Miller using your money, the money you pay to maintain our community's common areas, to do $3,800 worth of work on her own private property." The room exploded. The buzz of anger became a roar. "Thief!" someone yelled. "Resign!" shouted another. Karen was ashen. She banged her gavel on the table, but the sound was lost in the tumult. "Lies! These are doctored documents!" she shrieked, but her voice was thin and desperate. Gerald Finney, the dissenting board member, chose that moment to act. He stood up, his face pale but resolute. "They're not lies," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I saw the invoice. I questioned it. She told me it was for emergency common area work. I objected to the lawsuit too. It's all in the minutes. I'm sorry, I should have spoken up sooner." His confession was the final crack in the dam. The community's fury now had a single focus: Karen Miller. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, faces that were once passive or friendly, now contorted with rage and betrayal. She saw no allies, no support, Her reign was over, and she knew it. The fortress she had built with rules and intimidation had been demolished by a single, unassailable weapon. The truth. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of collective anger that crashed over the front table. Karen Miller sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief, as the community she had sought to dominate turned on her completely. The shouts of "resign" and "thief" grew louder, more insistent. Her 3 loyal board members looked terrified, shrinking in their seats as if to disappear. Only Gerald Finney remained standing, his confession hanging in the air like a final judgment. Arthur Henderson, the retired history teacher, stood up, his voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. "I believe we have a provision in our bylaws for a vote of no confidence and immediate removal of a board member for gross misconduct. I make a motion to remove Karen Miller from the board of directors, effective immediately." Maria Flores, from the other side of the room, immediately seconded it. "Seconded, and the rest of them too." The call was taken up by the crowd. "Vote, vote, vote." Karen, finally snapping out of her stupor, began banging her gavel furiously. "This meeting is out of order. This is not on the agenda. This is an illegal ambush." But no one was listening. Her authority had evaporated. The gavel was just a piece of wood in the hands of a disgraced woman. Dave, my JAG friend, stood up and addressed the room. His calm, authoritative presence instantly commanded attention. "Folks," he said, his voice easily filling the space, "Mr. Henderson is correct. Article 10, Section 4 of your bylaws allows for the removal of a director by a majority vote of the members at any special meeting. This is a legal and proper motion." He turned his gaze to the HOA secretary, a woman who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Madam Secretary, you are required to record the motion and call the vote." Trapped between the fury of the crowd and the calm certainty of a man who clearly knew the law, the secretary had no choice. She fumbled with her papers, her hands shaking. "A motion has been made and seconded to remove Karen Miller from the board of directors," she read, her voice barely a whisper. "All in favor, say aye." The response was a deafening, unified shout. "Aye!" It was a sound of pure catharsis, a release of years of pent-up frustration. "All opposed?" the secretary asked timidly. Silence. Utter, complete silence. Not a single voice rose to defend Karen. Even her most loyal cronies on the board remained silent, their faces turned away from her. "The motion carries," the secretary whispered, then looked at Dave, who nodded encouragingly. She cleared her throat and spoke louder. "The motion carries. Karen Miller is removed from the board of directors." Karen stared straight ahead, her expression blank. It was over. She had been publicly and unanimously stripped of the title that had been the sole source of her identity and power. Arthur Henderson wasn't finished. "I move to remove the remaining board members, with the exception of Mr. Finney, for their complicity." The motion was seconded and passed with the same overwhelming, thunderous aye. In the space of 10 minutes, the entire power structure of the Willow Creek Estates HOA had been dismantled. The crowd, sensing a new beginning, began to call out nominations for an interim board. Arthur Henderson was nominated. Maria Flores was nominated. A level-headed engineer named Frank, who had been quietly nodding along with my presentation, was nominated. Gerald Finney, in a surprising show of forgiveness from the community, was asked to stay on to ensure a smooth transition. A vote was held, and a new interim board was installed on the spot. Their first act was to unanimously vote Arthur as the new interim president. Arthur, looking both humbled and energized, took the center seat that Karen had just vacated. His first motion was simple. "I move that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association formally drop its lawsuit against Mr. Mark Caldwell, effective immediately." "Seconded," came a dozen voices. The aye was once again unanimous and deafening. "I further move," Arthur continued, "that the association issue a formal apology to Mr. Caldwell for the harassment he has endured, and to the Martinez family for the absurd and vindictive action taken against them." Another overwhelming aye. And then Sarah stood up. "Mr. President," she said, addressing Arthur, "on behalf of my client, I have one more piece of information for the community. Given the clear evidence of embezzlement of HOA funds, I have, as is my legal duty, already forwarded the relevant documents to the County District Attorney's Office. They will be opening a formal criminal investigation into Ms. Miller's conduct. A fresh wave of shock and awe went through the room. Karen, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally moved. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't say a word. With as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much, she turned and walked through the silent, parting crowd and out the door into the darkness. Her reign had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, ignominious retreat. The war was over. The bully had been deposed, not by force, but by facts. The community, so long divided and intimidated, was now united. They had found their voice, and the sound was one of justice. In the weeks that followed the great purge at the special meeting, a palpable sense of relief and renewal settled over Willow Creek Estates. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. It was like a cloud had lifted. People started talking to their neighbors again. Kids' toys reappeared in driveways. The Martinez family, in a cheerful act of defiance, repainted their front door an even brighter, more aesthetically jarring shade of blue. No one said a word. The new interim board, led by the calm and sensible Arthur Henderson, went to work immediately. Their first order of business was to hire a forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances under Karen's tenure. The audit confirmed everything we had found and more, uncovering several other instances of creative invoicing that benefited Karen and her friends. The total amount of misappropriated funds was close to $10,000. The HOA's liability insurance carrier, upon being presented with the evidence of criminal activity, denied the claim for the legal fees incurred in the lawsuit against me, just as Dave had predicted. This left Karen and her 3 ousted board members personally on the hook for the nearly $50,000 in legal bills their vendetta had generated. The HOA's new lawyer sent them a letter demanding reimbursement, threatening a civil suit if they refused. The hunters had become the hunted, trapped by the very legal system they had tried to weaponize. The criminal investigation into Karen proceeded slowly but surely. The district attorney's office, armed with our meticulously organized evidence and the full cooperation of the new HOA board, had an open and shut case. 6 months after that fateful meeting, Karen Miller was formally charged with felony embezzlement. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge to avoid a trial, receiving 2 years of probation, a hefty fine, and an order to pay full restitution to the HOA. The public record of her conviction was the final indelible stain on her reputation. Shortly after, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The house sold quickly. I never saw her again. The new board, with Sarah Jenkins providing pro bono legal guidance, undertook a complete overhaul of the HOA's covenants. They clarified the language, stripped out the ambiguous and overly controlling clauses, and added new provisions to ensure transparency and prevent the abuse of power that had flourished under Karen. One of their most significant changes was the addition of a new article, proposed by Arthur and drafted by Sarah. It was titled Article 12, Recognition of Pre-Existing Land Use and Environmental Protections. It formally acknowledged the protected status of my wildlife corridor and stated that the HOA would support and celebrate such features that enhance the natural beauty and ecological health of the community. My hedgerow went from being a violation to a celebrated community asset, enshrined in the very documents that had once been used to threaten it. My battle, which had started as a solitary defense of my own property, had become a catalyst for the restoration of an entire community. I had never intended to lead a revolution, only to protect a promise I had made to my wife. But in doing so, I had given others the courage to stand up for themselves. One cool autumn morning, about a year after my first confrontation with Karen, I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee. The sun was rising, casting a golden light across the yard. I looked out at the hedgerow. It was magnificent, a riot of fall color. Deep reds, bright yellows, rich purples. A flock of cedar waxwings descended upon it, feasting on the berries, their high-pitched calls filling the air. It was teeming with more life than ever. I thought about the journey of the past year, the threats, the stress, the late nights spent poring over documents. I thought about Eleanor and how fiercely she would have fought this battle herself, and how proud she would have been. A movement at the edge of my property caught my eye. It was Arthur Henderson, out for his morning walk. He saw me and waved, a broad smile on his face. He pointed toward the hedgerow and gave me a thumbs up. I raised my coffee cup to him in a silent salute. Justice isn't always about a dramatic courtroom victory. Sometimes it's about the quiet, steady work of holding your ground. It's about the power of a well-documented fact. It's about the courage of one person inspiring others and the quiet satisfaction of watching a community heal itself. The hedgerow stood as a testament to that. It was more than just a line of trees and shrubs. It was a border between tyranny and freedom, between manufactured uniformity and natural beauty. It was a living memorial to my wife, and now it was a symbol of our collective victory. The air was crisp and clean, the only sound was the chatter of the birds, and the peace was real, earned and lasting.